Hi, Dr. Perepa. Thank you so much for the talk that you gave this morning. For all of our CRAE listeners who weren't able to attend today, could you start off by telling our audience broadly what your research interests are?
A lot of my research has been around autism and cultural perceptions of disability and experience of families coming from minority ethnic communities. But other than that, I think I'm also interested in kind of wider dialogues within the field of autism, especially around sex and sexuality, and autism is kind of another piece of my research. But I think for this presentation, it was mainly cultural autism. Let's stick with that.
And what led you to focus your research on these topics?
It's a combination of factors, probably. As you can see quite clearly, I belong to a minority ethnic community myself. And when I was working in the field of autism in the Midlands, what I found was my experiences of belonging to a minority ethnic community and knowing families who have children on the autistic spectrum was not necessarily being replicated in their research around autism at that time, or even in terms of perceptions of service providers about how families from minority ethnic communities understand autism or experience autism. So that's what started my journey in terms of trying to perhaps give voice to the experience of individuals from minority ethnic communities who are affected by autism in one way or the other, and bring that dialogue so that perhaps we'll change service provision and how we understand and support individuals with autism and their families.
Thank you so much for that. Now, I think I'm going to ask some of the questions that weren't able to be raised during the webinar. Okay. One of them was, how can diagnostic tools be adapted to recognize autism within other cultural contexts?
I think part of that is to, as I say, as we would do with standardization of any assessment tools, you need to think of who have these assessment tools been standardized on. And also whether what we are identifying is necessarily considered as a disability within a different community context. So it's two-pronged level. One is actually acknowledging that a lot of autistic diagnostic tools have not been standardized on people who are not from white background. So we need to see, can we actually standardize and see the validity and reliability of these tools? Secondly, looking around with that is thinking, what are the kind of, I suppose, criteria we are having, what material we are using for a diagnostic process, and the cultural, I suppose, equivalency or applicability of those as well. Because as I say, thinking about the toys, the equipment, thinking about the questions we are asking is quite important. So there's a lot of work happening with diagnostic tools in terms of translation right now, but I think we need to move, actually, we perhaps need to stop the translation and actually start looking at the applicability before we translate it and check the validity of the translated then tool within different communities. It's harder for us in the UK because we can't have one tool as of now, which will perhaps be localized, because say, for example, if a tool is being adapted in Korea or in Oman, they are doing for their own population, whereas we have a population which comes from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. So standardization and conceptualization is a longer piece of work for us.
Relatedly, how do we address different views or beliefs about autism? How do we remain culturally sensitive while also providing families and individuals with the services that they need?
I think that's the important bit. Is it a service that they need? So actually understanding what is it that this individual or their family members would want and need is quite important. But it's also important to acknowledge that within a family unit, different family members would have different levels of cultural association and how much their own cultural beliefs or religious beliefs impact on their identity or their ideas about what they would want. So not making assumptions that because, say, for example, the parents have this particular view about autism, that would necessarily mean the siblings will have the same view, or the person with autism would necessarily have the same view. So it's understanding that individual differences within the family unit. And the main thing for me is actually having an open mind. I often say to professionals, question yourself. Say, for example, you're talking, oh, they're not parenting well. Start thinking, but what is good parenting, and how do I know what I think is good parenting is necessarily good parenting in this context? Unless we question them, we are likely to actually impose our own ideas, but also being understanding of the cultural norms. So, for example, music intervention, which is quite popular with young children with autism, in some cultural communities, like Muslim communities, in some Muslim families, music is considered to be culturally, religiously inappropriate. So even though it may be an evidence-based practice, they may not necessarily want to do it because practice of singing, especially women singing in front of men or men singing in front of women, would be considered as inappropriate task to do. So if we understand their belief systems and what they think, we may also be able to match the intervention that we would like to intervene for families or children. And similarly with adults, understanding and explaining. When I was working with a gentleman with autism who came from Sikh community, and he was saying, how do I actually explain autism in my community? Because there's no word for autism in my language. So how do we equip people with autism to have those dialogues, if that's important for them, for their identity and for their community and family to recognize their identity? How do we equip adults with autism to have those dialogues is also quite important. So looking at the individual needs and as I say, being able to be flexible with what we think is good practice is quite important.
Absolutely, it is quite important. Just to finish up, could you tell our audience what you think the future of this research is, and what are the implications of your own findings? And what would you recommend that researchers focus on?
Gosh, that's a lot there, Mel. The future of the research, well, I'm hoping, as I was saying in the presentation, that we'll move further than just thinking about the prevalence rates of autism in different ethnicities and parental experiences of autism, to actually go to some of those crux and core questions about what is autism and how is autism understood in different communities. Because in the UK and West, for example, we are moving towards neurodivergent kind of movement and saying diversity, difference does not mean a disability. But in some cultural communities, perhaps that's the view they already have, where we then say, oh, but you don't recognize autism and you need to understand autism first. Then perhaps just to come back to the position we are in, which is, but we are all different. So it's actually understanding what is considered as a difference in different communities and acknowledging that, I think is what I would like to happen in future. And my own work, I suppose, I'm keen on looking at improving services for minority ethnic communities living in the UK. So for me, it's more around service provision, a lot more of work, because autism as a condition exists in the UK, so no point in denying that. For me here, it's more about, is what we're providing is appropriate? And that's the direction of research that I would like to take more on. And I'm sure there's plenty of opportunities for everyone else to join in and do research in this field.
We look forward to seeing more on this topic, and I hope it does encourage more young researchers and early career researchers to take it up.
I certainly hope to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mel, for the opportunity.